Thomas Grayson was never a weak man. From a young age, he learned that the world has no patience for the weak, so he molded his body and mind to resist. He grew up on a farm where work began before the sun rose. He learned to hold a hoe before he could even read. When war came and conscription knocked on his door, he knew what to do. He survived battles that killed men much younger and stronger than him. He lost friends, he lost his youth, he even lost part of his hearing with incessant explosions that tore through the sky. But he never lost one thing: respect. The respect of his men, his superiors, his enemies. He was the kind of man who didn't need to speak loudly to be heard. His presence said it all. But time has its own cruel way of erasing greatness. Decades passed, his muscles were no longer the same, his back was no longer as firm, and society changed. The respect he had earned in the past no longer seemed to mean anything to those who didn't know his story. To most people, he was just another old man. Someone who moved slowly, who wore glasses to see better, who shopped alone in a corner market. No one saw the soldier he once was. No one saw the scars that told his story. And maybe, just maybe, he was beginning to accept that. Accepting that his time had passed. Until that night. Until that moment when he left the market and realized he wasn't alone. The headlights of the motorcycle shone against his tired eyes. 5 men, dressed in leather and wearing shiny helmets, blocked his path. The engines were still rumbling, drowning out the sound of the crickets that always heralded the arrival of night. The smell of gasoline and cigarettes mixed with the humid air. Thomas felt something he hadn't felt for decades. It wasn't fear. It was instinct. The same instinct that had saved his life so many times. The leader of the group, a tall man with a scruffy beard and tattoos on his arms, got off his motorcycle with a crooked smile. He walked slowly over to Thomas, took off his helmet and ran his hand through his disheveled hair. His eyes shone with a childish mischief, that typical confidence of someone who has never really been tested. "Look, Grandpa," he said, his voice slurred. "It's too late to be out alone, don't you think?" Thomas didn't answer. He just watched. Another motorcyclist laughed. A dry, forced laugh. "He doesn't even know where he is, bro. You're lost, aren't you, Grandpa?" Thomas pressed his lips together, his hand firmly holding the shopping bag. 5 against 1. He'd faced worse, but he was no longer the same man as before. His body no longer reacted as quickly. His strength was no longer the same, and he knew it. But there was something those men didn't know. Something that time could never erase. Thomas let go of the bag slowly. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his cell phone. The bikers laughed. "You're calling the police, aren't you?" The leader sneered, stepping forward. How sad. Thomas didn't dial the police. He dialed a number he hadn't used for years. A number he never thought he'd need again. A number that would change everything that night. The line rang only once before someone answered. On the other end, a firm but aged voice answered with a tone of surprise and respect. "Captain." Thomas didn't need to explain. He didn't need to ask. He just said 2 words. "I need it." And he hung up. The bikers looked at each other, confused. The leader crossed his arms and laughed, shaking his head. "What was that, Grandpa? Calling your little friends?" He took a step closer, leaning over until he was just a few centimeters from Thomas's face. His breath stank of alcohol and cigarettes. "Let me guess, your grandson, your caregiver." Thomas kept his gaze fixed, unwavering. The leader expected to see fear, but he found nothing but a heavy silence, something that bothered him more than any answer. Another biker, a thin man with restless eyes, pulled a pocket knife from his pocket and opened the blade with a metallic click. "Hey man, cut the crap. The old man's got nothing, he's just trying to be tough. Let's get this over with." The tension in the air was palpable. Thomas could already foresee the next moves. The leader would make a sarcastic comment. The skinny guy would make the first move. The others would stand around, ready to pounce on him like jackals. But then, the sound of engines. Not their bikes. Another kind of engine. Heavy, steady, the rumble of approaching trucks. The bikers stopped, exchanging nervous glances. The leader frowned and turned towards the street. The headlights cut through the darkness like sharp blades. 4 black pickup trucks without license plates emerged from the bend and entered the narrow street. Tires screeched on the asphalt as the vehicles came to an abrupt halt, blocking both exits. The doors opened at the same time. Men got out of the vans. They weren't young men. They weren't gym brutes in tight t-shirts. They were old, all like Thomas. But there was something about them that set them apart from any other man in the city. The way they moved, calculated, unhurried. The way their eyes scanned the scene, analyzing everything in seconds. None of them spoke. None of them needed to. The bikers felt the change in the energy of the place. What had once been a hunt now felt like something completely different. The leader turned to Thomas, confused, trying to understand. Who are these guys? Thomas didn't answer. The men who got out of the vans began to walk slowly towards the group. And at that moment, the bikers realized something terrifying. They were about to learn the real meaning of the word respect. The leader of the bikers tried to disguise his nervousness, but the trembling in his hands gave away his insecurity. He looked at the others for some reaction, some sign that he could do something. But the men in the vans were relentless. The oldest, with a thick gray beard and eyes as blue as the winter sky, stepped forward, his gaze fixed and calm, as if he already knew what was going to happen. He didn't say a word. He just looked at the leader, and the young motorcyclist, without knowing why, involuntarily took a step backwards, as if he were a puppet with its strings cut. The man with the gray beard slowly held out his hand, pointing at him. It took no more than that. The biker leader hesitated, his eyes flicking between the advancing figure and the other members of his gang. He felt his control of the situation slipping away like sand between his fingers. Something was wrong, but he didn't know exactly what. His heart was pounding in his chest, fear now rising in his throat. He opened his mouth, trying to protest, but the sound of a dry click cut through the air and silenced everyone. The man with the gray beard raised a pistol, his hand steady and without any sign of hesitation. The gleam of the gun's blade reflected the starlight, but the bikers were no fools. They knew that, although the man hadn't fired, the message was clear. They were at a crossroads. They either had to move away or risk the wrath of those who wouldn't hesitate. Do you have any idea who you're dealing with? The leader tried to assert himself again, but his voice was weak, as if he were drowning. The man didn't answer. He simply looked at Thomas, the old ex-soldier standing there, showing no fatigue or fear, but with a glint of something much deeper in his eyes, something these young men had never experienced. A life of resistance, of honor, and of an endless war against their own limits. It was as if his gaze was the end of a line that stretched back for generations. Thomas, with the calm that only someone who has faced hell can have, made an imperceptible movement with his head. The biker leader took another step back, already aware that the moment had arrived. He was about to lose control of something he didn't understand. And without another word, the others began to retreat, one by one. The scene that was unfolding was almost surreal. The biker gang, once confident and threatening, now seemed completely disarmed, not in terms of weapons, but of their aura of power. The silence that followed was deep, heavy. The only sound left was the rumbling of the pickup trucks and the sound of the wind cutting through the air. The men in the vans continued their slow, unhurried pace, as if the world were theirs. Not just any world, but a world that the bikers would never understand. And for a moment, Thomas felt a wave of relief and pride wash over him. The fight was no longer physical. It was no longer a question of strength or numbers. It was a question of respect, of legacy. A lesson that, without words, he had taught. And as the bikers walked away, humiliated and with their tails between their legs, Thomas looked at his saviors and, with a tired smile, muttered, "I can no longer fight for myself, but I can still fight for others." The silence remained, but now there was something more. When the last echoes of the motorcycles were lost in the dark night, Thomas stood still, his eyes fixed on the trucks driving away. The feeling of victory didn't come from physical combat, but from something much deeper and more powerful. He knew that, at that moment, it wasn't him who had won. What had won there was history, experience, the respect that came from decades of battles he had fought, not just in distant wars, but in life. When he looked at the men in the pickup trucks, he didn't see enemies. He saw old comrades in arms, those who had strayed from the path, but who still had something valuable inside them. And as much as the bikers had moved away, the biggest challenge lay ahead, regaining the trust they had lost, understanding that, in a world steeped in violence and disrespect, there was still a code that transcended generations. Thomas was not a man of words. He never had been. He preferred to act. But at that moment, he knew that what really mattered was the legacy he would leave behind. Respect was not earned with weapons, but with the soul. And as he looked at those men who had come to his rescue, he knew that although the world around him had changed, the hearts of real men still beat strong, echoing through time. He turned slowly, his steps firm and resolute, feeling the weight of the years on his shoulders, but with the same determination he had always had. It wasn't about what he could still do for himself, but what he could still teach others. The silence that enveloped the street now was not one of fear, but of reverence. And as he entered his house, Thomas knew that his role in that chapter had already been fulfilled. But the most important thing was that he had made others see for the first time that it wasn't just the young who could fight, but that true power came from those who knew what it was to live, what was to resist, and what was to respect. Their war had only just begun. Just for those of you who like a good story and have watched to the end, leave your comment below from which city you're watching, and I'll leave a heart in your comment. Bye, and see you in the next video.